Welcome everyone, Jesse here from the Subi Sanctuary, and today I'm going to be doing a how-to video on how to swap your USDM 251 for a JDM EJ251. So I'll get into the differences, the things you have to swap, the things you need to look out for, and show you how it's done. Step one is pretty obvious, so you're gonna need to remove your motor. As always, I like to keep my power steering and my air conditioning all completely intact. Here we have our domestic 251. Not too many of the 251s have this plastic intake manifold. I think it was just some of the 2004s that did. Needless to say, we have to take this off because it is not the same or even close to the JDM one. So how I like to do it is undo all the sensors and stuff first from the motor, because we're going to take the intake manifold off in one piece with everything coming with it except for the coolant crossover pipe. Alright, with everything undone from the manifold, so that is all the wires going to sensors that are on the motor, any of the PCV piping, or any of the coolant lines that attach to the crossover, because you won't be taking that off right now. And then it's just 4 bolts on each side to actually get the intake manifold to lift off. So we're going to take this off and put it aside for now. Alright, with the intake manifold off of the domestic motor, now we're going to do the same thing on the JDM motor. Same process. The JDM motor has some more accessories attached to it. Take them off as well, and then your intake manifold off and set it aside. Alright, now with the JDM intake manifold all undone, we'll be removing this and setting it aside. The JDM one stripped down, manifold off, and the domestic one stripped down with the manifold off. We can go over some of the differences now and things you'll need to swap. You'll be taking both of your valve cover vent pipes off and swapping them over. Depending on the year of your vehicle in putting in the JDM 251, these may actually be the same, but just compare, otherwise swap them. Next thing we'll notice is different is the coolant crossover pipe. So it has the sensor at the front there. Our domestic one, it's at the back, so we'll be swapping that. Again, some of the domestics, they are actually located there. If yours plugs in just the same, then you are fine to reuse this or leave it on the engine. Our knock sensor between the two of them is different, so we're going to be swapping the knock sensor. All right, now at the back of the engine here, our JDM one is a EGR engine. Some 251s are EGR. Our domestic 251 is not an EGR engine, and this is easily overcome. So here we are at the back of the domestic 251, and see that little plug there? You'll remove that. Then you'll simply take the little plug and put it in the hole. So tighten that down. That takes care of the EGR if you are swapping the JDM motor into a non-EGR car. Last but not least, this is the JDM engine. You can see the crank vent here is going to be a little pipe coming right out of the block. And then it has this hose on it, goes up here into a splitter. Then it actually has like its PCV valve here on the manifold, and the other one running out that way. This particular USDM engine has that cylinder threaded into the block, and then above it is the PCV itself, and then the vent pipe coming up there. So we are gonna have to switch that over. So we got the PCV valve unthreaded from here. This is a good time to replace it or at least clean it so it's moving freely. Over onto the JDM engine. What I did here, and this is the only spot you really gotta get creative, is I cut the original pipe down shorter, like the rubber pipe. Cut it down as short as possible so that the PCV valve can go all the way in and that your pipe goes to the bottom there. So I'm just putting some gear clamps on these. The PCV valve actually fits in the pipe really well, but still you don't really want to get a vacuum leak from there or oil leaking from there. So I'm just going to use some gear clamps there. All right, with that guy out of the way, I'm going to move on to the coolant crossover here. So I'm going to remove both of them. So now off with the domestic one. Clean up the bottom a little bit here. The JDM one. When putting your domestic one back on, see this little O-ring here? On the other side, it came out with the piece. You must replace these. These are pretty cheap little O-rings. Get them from the dealership. You really don't want to end up with a coolant leak under your intake manifold after you've put it all together. So there's the part number for the O-rings for the coolant crossover. I have a bunch of them just because I keep them in stock, but you'll only need 2. Then to get this guy out, I typically use like a little screwdriver. Once you kind of get in the edge there, be careful not to mess up your surface. Once you get it to start to pop, it comes out really easy. Then again, go through here, clean this up, get all that crap out. All right, now we're putting our new guys in. So these like to kind of jump out. So you have to keep walking it around until it really stays in. And then also when you're actually putting your coolant crossover back on, make sure these don't come out of place. So now we're putting on our domestic crossover onto the JDM engine here. What I like to do is like get it in place and then kind of hold it down so that you don't risk your O-rings coming out of place. All right, with our domestic coolant crossover on there, we can begin to move on to some other little things. So now I'm going to switch the knock sensor here. So now we have our domestic knock sensor. I always like to use the Japanese hardware. It's not so rusty. So we'll get him in place and pay attention to the orientation of the actual sensor because that does play a role in its function. Now right beside the knock sensor, at least in this particular case, and again something you should pay attention to, is this little line coming off of the heater core pipe. Goes up to the throttle body so you can see its path there, and then compared to the domestic one where it picks up under the throttle body, so you'll be swapping over this little hose. Again, see my rusty clamp there, definitely going to want to use the JDM clamp from the other engine. Alright, so now we've got our little pipe from the domestic one that goes on the heater core line there. Put them in place. Next, and while I'm at it, in my particular case again, I'm going to swap the valve cover vent hoses because they are different between the two. This is also a really good time to replace your spark plugs or any other preventative maintenance you want to do, like the valve cover gaskets. This particular motor is quite clean and doesn't appear to have a valve cover leak, so I'm going to leave it. At this point, we have everything we need to swap over to the JDM engine from the domestic engine. You could get into checking out your timing belt on your JDM engine. Also a good time to change it if needed. Now we are going to prepare to put the intake manifold on. So that involves taking off the old gaskets, which typically like to separate. So you've got to scrape that all off. On an engine stand, I like to tilt it to one way so less stuff goes into the intake there. But again, I'm still going to end up tilting it and spraying that all out just because it is pretty carboned up. So I use this, which is like a little gasket scraper. Just careful not to gouge it. That's it, work your way around, clean those surfaces all off. All right, I've got this surface pretty well cleaned off here. Before I tip the motor onto its side there, I've gone ahead and drained the oil and removed the oil filter. So this is the oil that would have been in it from Japan. So at this point, I'll go ahead and throw a new oil filter on there. So before going to clean out your little intake ports there, make sure your valves are closed. If they're not, just rotate the engine a little bit. This is something you should check before you're scraping your gasket off in case any goes in there. You don't really want to get it in the combustion chamber, so mine are closed. I'm going to tip it over and clean those out. With the surfaces all cleaned up on both sides and the intake ports all cleaned out, we are ready to prepare to put on our intake manifold. So if your engine has a cast intake manifold, like it's made of aluminum, you'll end up putting on like a flat gasket here. Again, you can get those at the dealership. If yours is like this one here with the plastic intake manifold, it actually uses like a little O-ring kind of thing that actually attaches onto the manifold itself. Now that we're ready to put our intake manifold on, there's one more thing I'm going to check. This mostly relates to if you had an older EJ251. is checking the cam gear teeth and the crank gear teeth versus your original one. In some of the older ones, they may be a different spacing. In that case, you would have to swap your crank gear underneath there and your cam gear if they are different. Between these two, I do not believe they're going to be different, but better safe than sorry, so I'm going to check that out. So it doesn't take a whole lot to check them. I've just got the one side of the timing cover off here and the crank pulley off there. So you can look in, and what you're looking for is the teeth and their location. So I see one right there, and that's it. And then looking in here, you can see all my little teeth under there. You're going to want to make sure that your domestic motor has the same style gears. If not, you will have to swap them. So over to my domestic one here, you can see 3 teeth there. So already that does look different. There's another tooth up there. And then looking at our crank gear here. So you can see big spacing, so 1, 2 teeth there, 1 over there. So in this case, I am gonna have to switch the crank pulley there along with the cam pulley. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. All right, with the cover off of the JDM here, I've lined up the timing and then I've marked it with a paint marker because I'm gonna reuse this belt because it's the best condition of the two. It looks really good actually. And then here, looking at our crank gear, you can really see the difference in the teeth. Over to the domestic motor here, again, I've lined up the timing and marked it all with a paint marker just so I can put this back together. This motor could be a good core for someone. And then again, you can see the difference in the crank gear teeth there. With the timing belt and the gear off of both of the engines, I can show you here the difference. So the bottom ones are the domestic ones. You can see the teeth count. And then these are the JDM ones. So this is definitely something you need to pay attention to and swap if necessary. Also, if you're not changing your timing belt kit, check all your pulleys, make sure they're smooth, quiet, and don't have any play. These are all good. So on my domestic one, for example, things you don't want. And I'm reusing my tensioner from the JDMs. To get this little pin back down here, you have to slowly squeeze it periodically over the period of like 20 minutes. And then once it's all the way down, you can put your pin back through and reuse that no problem. So now I'm gonna go ahead and swap my gears and get my belt back on. All right, with my tensioner squished back down there, I used a pin. If you don't have a pin, you could use like a tiny Allen key or something like that. Next thing before putting this on is all the timing pulleys should use blue Loctite, so put a little dab on there. And then for the most part, I've got all my timing stuff kind of lined up, so I'll pop that guy over. Those ones are clamped down just to keep it in place. Get this all in place, and that should slide right in there, and I just thread that in by hand so that you don't cross thread it. Once you're all set there, you can pull your pin. We're all lined up now. We've got our tensioner back in, tightened down. We can take our clamps off and we can pull our pin. And now we are all set to put the timing cover back on and the crank pulley. And lastly, make sure you tighten this guy. I like to tighten it after the belt's on so it doesn't rotate. So we got all our timing cover back on and our crank pulley. Now I'm ready to drop on the intake manifold. With the domestic intake manifold back on, I like to tighten down all the intake manifold bolts before I start to plug anything in. Before doing that, make sure you haven't like pinched any hoses, lines, or plugs. Work your way around from one corner, plugging in and attaching everything you have to. All right, there we are with everything hooked up. We got the new spark plugs in and we're ready to drop our motor in. So one final thing before putting in your replacement motor. So we have a dowel there and a dowel there. You want to make sure that on your transmission side, the dowels aren't stuck in there or else you're never going to get your motor to mate. So this little guy here will just bang them right through and leave the ones on the motor. Thing here, you'll notice on your JDM engine, these bottom studs are always removed before they send the engine, I guess for shipping purposes. So I just take the other ones off of the old motor. You can either double nut on there and remove it, or I just grab it with a vice grip and it spins out pretty easy. So make sure you put those in before you get to putting your motor in, because you can't put these in after because the axle is in the way. All right, and I'm back with the motor in the car. I've got everything hooked up and all the fluids in it, so I'm ready for the first fire up. You should not expect any check engine lights or codes from doing this swap. It should trick the car into thinking it's the exact same motor going back in if you followed this swap procedure correctly. Here we go with a fire up. Right, and there it is, just purring away. Here we are inside the car, and as you can see, no check engine lights. Since the battery was unhooked, it's got to relearn a little bit. We're starting to warm up, and everything's looking good, and we're ready for a test drive after this. All right, well there you have it. We're all done here. Hopefully this helped you guys out in doing your own swap. Make sure you like, subscribe, and comment if you have any issues, questions, or concerns. Till the next one. Thanks for watching.